Hi everyone, welcome back to Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. I'm your host, David Thompson. Today it's my privilege to be joined by Dr. Richard Fox, who is a professor of history at the University of Southern California and the recent author of Lincoln's Body, A Cultural History, which is now out with W. Norton. So, Dr. Fox, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Now, here we are, another book on Lincoln, on the surface people might think, oh, really, another? And if people have been to D.C., they know if you go to the center across from Ford's Theater, you can see this stack of Lincoln books that literally are several stories high. But you are, I really do truly think, coming at this from a bit of a different angle. So why don't you start us off by just offering a bit of an overview of what this book really is about?
Thank you. I definitely am having trouble keeping up with all the Lincoln books myself, and so I understand that there are, in a sense, more Lincoln books than anyone could ever handle. I felt, as I got started on this Lincoln's Body project, that I did actually have something a bit different to offer, and it hadn't occurred to me that it was totally original, but it definitely struck me as a particular slant on Lincoln that had more or less been let go of lately. And so I felt like I could, in a sense, revive something that was traditional. At the time of Lincoln's death, I felt people had a very highly developed sense of his body. And that was initially what I wanted to try to recapture, to bring back what people in 1865 were thinking when they spoke of Lincoln's body. So it has several dimensions. It has, first of all, simply his appearance, his looks. The physical man made such a big impression on people in his lifetime. And then, of course, at the moment of his death, that all came flooding back to them. The physical Lincoln, whom they would never know again, that was a dominant theme in the funeral period. And then secondly, that made people remember this dimension of his body, which was its accessibility. He was especially eager to mix with people, to let them see him up close. And we got a good sense of that from the recent Spielberg movie on Lincoln, where Lincoln in his office is constantly welcoming ordinary citizens into his presence. That, I thought, was itself worth a retreatment. I thought his accessibility then was the second aspect after his appearance that was really on people's minds in his lifetime and at the moment of his death and soon after. In the third way that the body entered the story for me, it's his service to the people, which, as was already being noticed during his life, but then especially emphasized after his death, his body withered during his presidency. So people were very sensitive of the changes that took place in his body. Indeed, people were afraid that he might die in office. They said this frequently. He might die in office because of his exhaustion. And in fact, in March of 1865, he took a trip to Virginia to visit General Grant's headquarters. And that trip was, in a sense, explained as a vacation so that he would have a chance to recover from all of the office seekers that had pressed in upon him after the second inaugural. That element of physical withering then became, and there's a great speech many, many decades later by Theodore Roosevelt in 1909 at the centenary of Lincoln's birth. Roosevelt emphasized the service, the Republican service with a small r, of Lincoln to the people, and that service caused the withering of his body because he was so diligent in serving the people, and also that withering became a sign of the great service that Lincoln had rendered to the people. And then, of course, the last element of the body, after the appearance and the accessibility and the service withering, it was simply his death, and the way in which people in 1865 took his death as a gift to them. It wasn't just that he was victimized by an assassin. It was that he had voluntarily put himself in a position, a risky position, where someone might take his life. In that sense, people in 1865 tried to interpret him as a soldier for the nation. That sense of gift then became, in effect, the last element of the meaning of his body for them.
Now, what inspired you to tackle such a topic? It doesn't strike me as something that, would come to somebody offhand very easily.
Right. It's a bit of a distinctive approach. It came to me, I think, partly because I had just written a book on Jesus in America. I was very conscious of the idea of bodily sacrifice from that whole project. I also, though, felt that this was something very strikingly present in the commentary on Lincoln in 1865 and after 1865. And so it then was very tempting to work on this funeral period, because I thought that aspect of Lincoln's contribution to the nation had been recently minimized and maybe even forgotten to a large extent by the general population. There had recently been, since the 1990s, a lot of attention to Lincoln as a great orator, a great writer, Lincoln the wordsmith. This had not been started by Gary Wills's book Lincoln at Gettysburg, but that 1992 Pulitzer Prize winner bestseller had a lot to do with waking up, I think, the general American readership to the fact that Lincoln was a great creator of speeches and letters. And in Wills's interpretation, obviously, Lincoln had a tremendous impact on 19th and 20th century America by spinning a verbal masterpiece at the Gettysburg dedication of the cemetery. And that I thought of always as a tremendous truth about Lincoln, but over the course of the 1990s, it was sort of the whole story. It even outweighed his deeds. In other words, his words became the main part of the story. So I felt that focusing on his body, including the bodily sacrifice, which in a sense was his last deed for the nation, his last act, that would be a very good way to bring back the major emphasis that I thought 1860s Americans, in the North at least, had given to Lincoln. The body and its gift, the gift of the body being his last deed. They were, of course, very interested in Lincoln's words, too. And so I don't want to just substitute the body or his final deed for his great oratory. That was on everyone's mind, always, including the people of 1865. But I'm trying, in effect, to set up a new triad where his body is right there with his words and deeds. And I thought it would be nice to make the point that for the contemporaries of Lincoln, mid-19th century Americans, late 19th century Americans, going right up to the centenary of 1909, a huge celebration in which, of course, many people were still alive who knew of Lincoln during his own day. That would be the nexus of my book, the triple story of the words, the deeds, and the body.
Now, I mean, you've obviously alluded to this a little bit here, but I wondered if you could just speak perhaps a little bit more to, I guess, the political nature here of Lincoln's body while he's alive, and how he's being used as a tool by both of the major parties while he's president.
That's a nice question, and I guess the relatively short answer would be that Lincoln himself used his body politically by emphasizing his common origins, his, in a sense, coming from the people. That was very important to his success. But the body element is crucial to that, because Lincoln and then his Republican capital R, first Whigs and then Republican capital R supporters, they realized that Lincoln had political legs because of his strange appearance, even his ugliness. And believe it or not, a common phrase for him and the way he looked was ugly and grotesque. That was a phrase, and the emphasis that was put on it, I think, was partly for political reasons. That is, here is a guy who was given no advantages at the start of his life whatsoever. He had no family wealth, he had no education, he had no real military experience. In fact, he made light of his one little trip into the so-called military side of things in Illinois as a young man. But a main element of what he didn't have as an asset was looks. And so his common appearance, and even ugly and grotesque appearance, I think, came in very handy politically for him. And I think he knew this because he could laugh at it. And then suddenly he was proof of the ability of the United States to deliver upward mobility for anyone. And so he became like the poster boy for the free political culture of the United States, in which any young white man could make his way through rising in the ranks. And that, I think, the Republicans played, like the Whigs before them, to great success as his career developed. On the Democratic side, in the North, there was also tremendous emphasis on his looks, but there I think it was largely to try to put him down and say he didn't look presidential. And one finds lots of evidence of this in 1860 when he gets the nomination. Even before the nomination, Democrats are saying, well, obviously this guy couldn't be a good president because he has no experience. He in addition is not just ugly, but he doesn't know how to dress. He doesn't know how to comport himself. And one finds striking statements of this, not just about Lincoln, but about other friends of Lincoln. There's a famous, or a big letter in my book from a Democrat from New York who called both Lincoln and Stanton horribly ugly. And in Lincoln's case, if anything, it was worse that he didn't know how to carry himself as a dignified public official. He was too kind of common and ordinary and just laughably uncouth. And so that, on the Democratic side, I think, I have no idea if it actually worked politically, but certainly they tried to disparage him for his looks and his way of carrying himself.
Now, obviously we're coming up actually here on the 150th of Lincoln's assassination, and there's obviously the subsequent funeral train after that eventually makes its way back to Illinois. So I wondered if we could just capture that brief moment and how is Lincoln's body being depicted, how is it being used, both in the immediate wake of the assassination as well as this tribute to him as he moves from city to city throughout the North to his final resting place.
Right. This is how my book started as I was thinking about it long ago. I was thinking of a book on Lincoln's body that would just cover the 3 weeks after his death. I thought that the funeral train episode was so under-analyzed, and really there were just a few popular books about it, but there was really no scholarly, extensive, comprehensive treatment of it. And so I got started really on that book. But that's such a great question, and it's such a momentous experience for Americans, even the ones who didn't get to see the body, and there were 1 million who did, we think. Even those who didn't get to see the train, and there were probably another 6 million who saw the funeral train go by. So 7 million out of 25 million Northerners at the time got to see either the train or the body itself, because the body was opened to view. A lying in state took place in 12 different, 12 cities, including the District of Columbia, where there were 2 viewings, and then 7 states, in addition to the District of Columbia, had viewings of the body. So that's where roughly 1 million people entered the picture. So just as a majestic event, a majestic occasion where Americans of all persuasions and all races came together, and journalists at the time talked about that, how bizarre it was to see in Baltimore, for example, where Lincoln had been threatened with assassination in 1861, to see all manner of white Maryland residents coming together with former slaves, still not legally free, or maybe yes, in the state level of Maryland, but nationally the the amendment had not yet been ratified by enough states. That would come in December of 1865. So in the funeral train period of April and early May, there was a tremendous joining together of Americans in this mourning moment. That doesn't mean they all agreed about Lincoln. And it became very obvious very quickly during the mourning period that there were tremendous differences, and that Democrats and Republicans were using Lincoln politically in different ways already. I point out the differences between George Bancroft's eulogy of Lincoln on April 25th, 1865, and Charles Sumner's on June 1st, 1865. So right there in the mourning period, there's a tremendous difference of opinion about what Lincoln would have us do now. And that is, the differences then is as much a part of the story as the unification. But definitely there was a widespread love for Lincoln, and that's expressed in the turnout of people, Democrat, Republican, white, and black, in these northern viewings of his body. I guess I could go on indefinitely about the interesting aspects of this funeral train itself, but let me just mention that this is maybe the most surprising thing to me in doing my research. Over those 3 weeks, there was a very different tone to the funeral train and to the reception it received in different cities, and people viewing the body felt differently as those 3 weeks unfolded. The body, actually 2 weeks of the funeral train itself, it left Washington on April 21st. It arrived in Springfield on May 3rd, and then he was put into the temporary, it wasn't interment, it wasn't underground, it was just a public receiving vault where he was initially put to rest. So in that 3-week period, there was first a tremendous emphasis on, in the various cities that planned pageants, on getting the most possible people to see Lincoln's body, and on expressing our horror at the assassination, blaming the South, but interestingly, not just blaming the South, but blaming Northern Democrats for setting up the assassination. And then in a couple of cases, remarkably, and here's another big surprise, Republicans like the editor of the New York Times, Henry Raymond, he prints an editorial, I believe written by him, on the very day that Lincoln's body arrives in New York City, April 24th, 1865. The New York Times editorial says, Abraham Lincoln himself was culpably remiss in putting himself in the way of an assassin. And the only surprising thing, says Henry Raymond, I think, the editor of the New York Times, the only surprising thing is that it didn't happen earlier. I would have expected this to happen because he kept putting himself at risk, and he was selfish in doing so. He just wanted the personal glory of being out there with the people instead of thinking of his public duty. And that, I'm still shocked that the editor of the New York Times would print that editorial on the day that Lincoln's body arrived in New York City. But that's 1865. People were so traumatized, especially Republican moderates like Henry Raymond, because he wanted Lincoln around for Reconstruction. The radical Republicans, oddly enough, almost rejoiced in the assassination. I mean, it's hard to say that without being misunderstood, but they were very clear that God, Providence, had acted to remove Lincoln at that moment, and thank God for doing that. That was sort of their attitude. They weren't saying it was, something they wanted done, but God wanted it done, obviously, they said. But that's just, I mean, really, they were, and they said privately, there's where private sources do come in handy. They actually were glad that Lincoln had been removed because it would make it easier then to punish the Confederates and make perhaps even a social transformation of power in the South. All right, so all sorts of things are happening right away, but just to finish my overall point about the 3 weeks, in the first week, the emphasis is on getting the most possible people to see the body, and then, let's all get together around Lincoln's sacrifice. That's sort of. But in the second week, and then certainly in the third week, a lot of people start worrying about the condition of Lincoln's physical remains. And the leading public statement of this, or public declarer of this, was Charles Page of the New York Tribune, who was on the funeral train. And he started to believe and said that the mourning had taken on a different tone. Now people, he said, were coming to look at the remains of Abraham Lincoln out of morbid curiosity because the body had deteriorated so much. And therefore, there was this sense that the proper mourning, the mourning for this Republican hero, was being replaced by an improper mourning. That is just a desire to see this gory sight. And that changed the flavor of what was happening, I think, in that last period after New York City, when the body got to Albany, Buffalo, Cleveland, Columbus, Indianapolis, and Chicago, and Springfield. That dynamic entered more and more. That is, maybe we were wrong to want a 3-week period between the assassination and the putting him to rest in Springfield. Maybe Mary Lincoln, who pleaded with Edwin Stanton for a shorter funeral train that would have gone directly west from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh and then the Midwest. Instead, the train went all the way up to Albany, New York, and then over to the west. The long trip began to seem like maybe it wasn't fair to Lincoln. That story, I think, is an important aspect of those 3 weeks that I don't think had been told much. And so I would just then finish telling that part of it by saying that I bet Abraham Lincoln himself wouldn't have minded at all being a body that just deteriorated, because his main goal in his life was to always be with the people. At any period of his presidency, he would rather be with the people than anywhere else. And the most, to me, just inspiring moment is his trip to Richmond in early April. The Confederate troops have withdrawn from Richmond on the night of April 2nd, April 3rd. On April 4th, Abraham Lincoln goes to Richmond and walks through the downtown in the middle of a huge crowd, mostly slaves, some, maybe 1/3, according to an eyewitness, white people, most of those probably Union soldiers. But Lincoln just decided spontaneously, this was not planned, that he would rather walk 3/4 of a mile through downtown Richmond, surrounded by a mass of people, than be driven in a so-called ambulance, just a vehicle, army vehicle. And to me, that sums up his whole Republican, with a small r, commitment to being with the people. Therefore, if he'd been asked, after you're dead, would you like to have a train ride? Of course, there's no way to know what he would have said, but I suspect that he would have said, just let the people come and see my body for as long as they can stand seeing it. I bet that's exactly what he would have said.
Now, as we move beyond the mourning period, Dr. Fox, we get into, obviously the second portion of this book. It's entitled The Enshrined Body, and it takes us from beyond the mourning period up really until 1909 and the anniversary of Lincoln's centenary. So I wondered if you could kind of trace for us a little bit of, what's the status of Lincoln's body, so to speak, as we move through the remainder of the 19th century.
Okay, well, the second part of the book, as you say, is called The Enshrined Body. And the first point to make is that even during the mourning period, people were eagerly planning for this enshrinement that took place after, roughly it started, as far as the monuments go, in 1868, around there. So it took a while for the sculptural monuments to be produced and then actually put up in cities. The memorials, though, include not just the enshrinement by memorial, includes verbal memorials as well as sculptural ones. And those, of course, started right away with Whitman's poetry, most importantly in 1865, and many other poems written by ordinary people, which filled the newspapers in 1865. Other great oratory that develops in the late 19th century. In addition to the eulogies given right after the assassination, the speech by Frederick Douglass at the Washington, D.C. dedication of the Emancipation Monument, 10 blocks east of the Capitol, still there today. His speech there in 1876 is, to my mind, maybe the greatest speech ever given about Lincoln. It's really worth everyone's while to go and read it and think about it. It's brilliantly structured and brilliantly spoken. So those enshrinements, verbal and sculptural, culminated in Augustus St. Gaudens's 1887 sculpture. We usually call it the Standing Lincoln in Lincoln Park in Chicago. And everyone, whenever they're in Chicago, if they haven't seen this, they need to go to Lincoln Park and see it firsthand. You have to see not only the statue, but the surrounding setting that was just as carefully planned and beautifully executed as the statue itself. This bronze statue of Lincoln looking down, holding his lapel, his foot sticking out over the pedestal. He's meditating on something, and there's an empty chair behind him. So we're in effect told that he's just now standing. A minute ago he was sitting, and he's risen probably to address a crowd. And he's thinking now, just before beginning his speech, about what he's going to say. That meditative, contemplative Lincoln of 1887 is still the greatest statue that was ever made of him. And so I spend time looking at the interconnections between words and sculptures, especially in this period, but also the first great theater performance of 1909, Benjamin Chapin, and that, I mean, that Lincoln look-alike, Benjamin, he's a remarkable figure in the whole 1909 celebration, enshrining Lincoln through his own body. And people who saw it were astonished, and people who remembered Lincoln were astonished at the likeness between Benjamin Chapin and the original Lincoln. That set up then the films, which also were important even as of 1909, but the ones that, of course, came after the silent era, the 1920s, were the start of planning for the talking Lincolns. And the film enshrinement, though, is part of that period of even up to 1909. At the celebration of Lincoln's birthday at Wanamaker's department store in New York City, they showed a film at that February 12th, 1909 celebration of Lincoln's birth.
And finally, we move into the final portion, I guess you could say, of the book, and then that third section being the national body, which takes us through 20th century and up into the early part here of the 21st century, which you've already alluded to a little bit, discussing President Obama and the parallels drawn with then Senator Obama, also from Illinois, but as well the Lincoln movie by Spielberg. So please take it away.
What I would like, first of all, to say about that final period of the national body, Lincoln now being largely a hero for North and South. It's, you know, still a difference of intensity and passionate engagement with Lincoln between North and South, but the important fact is that whites, North and South, did largely decide they wanted to reconcile by this early 20th century period. Unfortunately, that caused Northerners to turn away from what Northern whites to turn away from what had been on many of their minds in 1865, 1875 still. That is more access to citizenship for black people. But nevertheless, this white reconciliation did largely take place, and that is an important fact for understanding the Lincoln Memorial in 1922, when still President Harding, Chief Justice Taft are telling the audience at the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial in 1922 that Lincoln was not mainly an emancipator. He was mainly a reunifier of the nation. So it's the culmination of that period of white reconciliation. Very soon thereafter, though, black people start using the Lincoln Memorial as a gathering place. And there are events that take place. There are black groups coming to the Lincoln Memorial in 1926, for example, and claiming that the people who dedicated the grand edifice and the statue in 1922 had been wrong, that Lincoln was the great emancipator. That was his main historic importance. And this track of black memory of Lincoln then culminates initially with Marian Anderson's great performance of operatic arias in the Lincoln Memorial in 1939 on Easter, having been denied access to all of the halls of Washington, D.C. because of her race. She and others organized this event at the Lincoln Memorial, which then became the great edifice for emphasizing the equality of all citizens, up until Martin Luther King's 1963 performance of his almost operatic I Have a Dream in August of 1963. That legacy of civil rights, I think, culminates, of course, with the civil rights movement between 55 and 65, King's great decade of leadership. Then, in effect, between 65 and 75, Vietnam displaces the civil rights movement, and Lincoln's stature changes dramatically for many liberal whites and blacks, for whom the face of the nation, in effect, is now the face of the imperialist state. And Lincoln's stature shifts, and it's not until the 1990s with I already mentioned the Gary Wills book, Lincoln at Gettysburg, when a large number of white liberals come back to seeing this almost centrist Lincoln as a tremendous prophetic figure who understood in the mid-19th century that you can't get what you want all at once. It was better to approach the elimination of slavery, which he always detested, better to approach its eradication gradually so that it will actually happen. That's indeed what makes Frederick Douglass's 1876 speech so important, that Douglass saw the truth of that statement, that Lincoln had understood better than the abolitionists, like himself, Frederick Douglass, how slavery would actually be ended on the ground. It would be because you waited for the appropriate time. No one foresaw the Civil War, of course, but Frederick Douglass in 1876 thought of Lincoln as the political idealist and realist who understood the way that history actually would work to end slavery. Then, as you say, we get up to the Obama era and the Spielberg movie, and in effect, I see those, the Obama presidency as, and the Spielberg movie, as of one piece in emphasizing Lincoln the Emancipator, but also, in Obama's case, telling us between the lines that there's no longer any special relationship between Lincoln and black people. The historic tie, the historic legacy that was developed between 1865 and 1965, in which black people took the lead in remembering that Lincoln was an emancipator, that legacy is now completed. There's now, with Obama's election in 2008, no job, no position, no office that black people are, by definition, denied. And that is the culmination of Lincoln's equality of opportunity legacy. Of course, there's not on the ground actual equality of opportunity even today. Black people are not able to advance or rise as universally as maybe white people are. But the point is that there's no arbitrary limit to what any black person can achieve or white person can achieve. Until Obama, we wouldn't have known that a black person could be elected president. And that to me changes everything. And it makes the Obama inadvertently the cause of this new development, which is there's no special relationship between black people and Lincoln. I think what Obama actually has achieved is to make Lincoln now an inspiring figure for anyone, any individual who wants to look into Lincoln's writings and Lincoln's life, and indeed Lincoln's body, which Obama spoke of directly in his nomination speech, or rather, not nomination speech, but his speech in 2007, entering the process of trying to become president. He spoke there of Lincoln's body as well as his words and deeds. So the face of the nation after 1860, or rather after 1909, the face of the nation after 1909 had many shifts and ups and downs, and I think we've ended up with, in 2015, a Lincoln who is mainly the emancipator again, and it's going to be very interesting to see if that holds into the rest of the 21st century, or if perhaps it would make sense to me that conservatives would again emphasize what is part of Lincoln's legacy. That is, Lincoln, the advocate of true pull yourself up by your own bootstraps and don't expect anybody to do it for you. That kind of Lincoln, the more laissez-faire side of Lincoln, is one that you would expect, I think, conservatives to emphasize more than they have been doing lately.
Well, and I suppose time will tell, Dr. Fox. But I wanted to thank you again for coming on and speaking with us. Everyone, again, the book is Lincoln's Body, A Cultural History, out with Norton now. It's a wonderful read, and I think I can safely say that it truly presents a completely different approach to Lincoln than most of us are accustomed to who study and love the Civil War, but one that you should eagerly pick up and take a look at, because I think, once again, you'll never look at Lincoln the same, and it is a welcomed addition to all the other books that we have out there on our 16th president. So, Dr. Fox, thank you so much for coming on, and perhaps in case you dabble back into the Civil War again, we can have you back on.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.